In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. Welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Joining us today is Bob Omotowa, the chairman and on the advisory board of Montserrado. Bob, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Kevin. My pleasure.
Bob, you got an inspiring story. Let's just go to the beginning. Tell us about some of your earliest moments of working in the storeroom for Shell.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. I think that was in 1993. I had just joined Shell. Prior to that, I was already working as a teacher in a secondary school. So this was interesting to start working in a big multinational company like Shell. I was very excited joining the company because it was going to be a new opportunity for me to really get to see global organizations in real life. So the first posting was in the storeroom, and this was in a warehouse in Warri, in the western parts of Nigeria. As you can imagine, in an oil and gas company, the storeroom is probably one of the lowest places you can be starting from. It's not in the field, it's not in production, it's not in finance or commercial. But what it gives you, I think it's a real opportunity to see the business, from the bottom, really looking at the whole organization. Also, because it was a place where most of the production was supported from, you also got to see, the real action in the organization. But I think what struck me very early on really was how much disorganized the warehouse was. It was quite disorganized. It had been neglected over the years, as I think most low-level places in organizations sometimes are not the best places to go to. But what I then saw was opportunities. I saw this is an opportunity to make a difference, an opportunity to really make this a place where people wanted to work. The staff in the place were not so happy working in the place. Nobody likes to work in a disorganized place. Customers were not so happy about the warehouse as well, because materials were all strewn all over the place. And there were a lot of accidents happening, people falling over, injuring themselves. But for me, what I saw were great opportunity to make a difference. And I started to, work with my staff, work with the customers, work with the management team to bring in, new talents into my organization, but to also set out a vision of what we wanted to achieve. And within 2 years, we were able to turn the place around. Really, we really, created an environment that was really very inspiring for staff. Things became well arranged. I had this vision in my head at the beginning that we wanted to be the Walmart, the Sainsbury, because it's in this sort of supermarkets, and they were really, really very, they were places you wanted to walk in. So that was what I used to discuss with my staff, and we created that kind of environment. And I was very pleased that within 2 years, the leadership of the organization started to bring in, their friends or their visitors to come and look at what a difference we had made within such a period. So really great, to working at that bottom, but a great opportunity to make a difference, and a great opportunity to bring some of the best practices that I had read about to bring it to life in the warehouse.
It's interesting, Bob. So you wanted to make this change. You just wanted to simply make things better. And I'm sure that a lot of other people in that storeroom wanted to do the same, except what do you think kind of made you a little bit different, and why things were actually able to change by the actions that you made?
I think one I will say is the belief that you can make a difference. I think it starts from that. Once there's a will, once there's a courage, then I think you start to something. I think people had lost motivation, and probably lost a bit of hope by the time I was in the place, that things were probably not going to change. They hadn't seen it change for a while. But I think coming in and coming in as a fresh pair of eyes, but with a bit clarity in my head, what I think could be achieved, and I think the will to make that difference was what was key. What I find in a lot of job that I've done, from that warehouse, is that you need courage. You need courage to be able to make a difference. The
Mm.
big difference, of course, when you work in developing countries as against if you're working in the Western world, is that the hurdles to overcome are a lot higher in developing countries because you will find it difficult to see normal things that you see in the Western world. You find it more challenging to make because infrastructures are not as good. You don't have as many facilities as you will have in the Western world. The capabilities in societies are not as great. But you must be determined. You must have the courage to be able to overcome those challenges. And I think once you put yourself into it, what I find is that it surprises, the human being surprises itself what it can achieve. I
Mm.
think if you look at what we've achieved as a human race over the period in which we have been here on Earth, I think we've achieved some amazing things that I think it comes down to bottom line. Do you have the will? Do you have the vision? And do you have the courage to overcome some of the challenges that you will face, irrespective of where you are starting from?
Interesting. So, Bob, some people have that sense of belief in them, and sometimes it's learned along the way. Did you know you had, yeah, I don't know, yeah, I guess what it took in order to make that change? I mean, how did you acquire such a strong, confident belief in yourself?
I think, Kevin, I will say I developed some of my core values right from childhood. And I think there were three key areas that I developed those core values from. The first, I think, came from, the farm. My father grew up as a farmer. He trained himself through school and university working on the farm. So everywhere he walked, he always had a farm. And so I found myself, every Saturday and every holiday, having to go to the farm to work with him and my siblings as well. What I learned from the farm were, I think, three key lessons. One was that you needed to work very hard. Hard work was quite important on the farm because that's what makes a difference. You needed to persevere. You had to believe in the plan and persevere that all the efforts you're putting in, you will see the output, you will see the product in some time to come. And the other thing I learned was that you really had to also plan, in advance because there are seasons for everything. There's the rainy season, there's the summer, and all of that. So those three things I learned really hard from the farm: hard work, perseverance, and planning. Uh, the other place I did learn quite a number of things as well, I would say, was in the church as well. I did learn quite a lot going to the church. I grew up as a Christian home, and the Ten Commandments, I think, were things that resonated with me throughout my upbringing, and a number of those, stay with me till today. Core values such as honesty and integrity, I think, were paramount when come through such upbringing. But the last thing, the area that I learned some of my values, I think, came from while growing up in Nigeria. I also had observed that a few companies, big multinationals, big companies, were really going bankrupt. We had the Nigeria Airways at that time. We had shipping line. We had iron and steel companies, big organizations that had really fallen flat. And as I studied these organizations, I found a few things were responsible. Part of them was, of course, the corruption was an issue in some of those organizations. Lack of planning, I think, was an issue. Organizations were resting on their oars. They were not really, driving for best practices. They were not driving for to beat their competition, and they were not planning well in advance. So I put it upon myself that wherever I walked, I was going to be the change that I wanted to see. I wanted to make this difference in whatever role that I fulfilled. And so those were things that were with me before I moved into that storeroom. The knowledge of what hard work, perseverance, and planning could bring, the value of honesty and integrity in whatever we did, but also the need for looking for best practices, the need for being very competitive, the need for having the courage to really bring the best practices into life were things that really drove me and were paramount before I started in the storeroom.
It's fascinating, and what also strikes me is that what is another need for business leaders, hopefully listening to this, is the need for bottom-up leadership. Listening to people on the front lines, understanding them, taking their wisdom, their knowledge, their day-to-day information, and learning from it, adjusting from it. What about the leadership at that time struck you as an organization that you wanted to work for? I mean, was this common that a large organization like Shell is going to go down to the storeroom and, train and put a lot of time and energy into somebody who is actually making some change? I mean, is that something that's normal in most organizations that you've been associated with?
I think my experience of working in organizations, I mean, most of my working experience was in Shell, either in Nigeria, in the UK, or in Holland. Um, and, what I would describe with my experience is that leaders in all these organizations um, are always, of course, looking for, uh, not just bottom line profitability, but they're also looking for best in class competitive performance as
Mm,
well. And they look across the organizations for where talents are and where those talents could make a difference in the various areas. In one of the examples, I worked in the North Sea, in the early 2000s, and in a particular example, we had quite a number of what we call supply vessels. These are vessels that take materials to our offshore uh, platforms. And we had the number of vessels, probably about 20, that were divided into, some were going into production platforms, while some were going into the rigs as dedicated vessels. Uh, Although quite young then and quite still low level, I felt at that time that there was an opportunity to combine these, resources and rather than have them dedicated by function, to be dedicated by geography. So if you had rigs and supply and platforms in one location, like in the Brent, that you have those supplied by some combined vessels. Did the analysis, did the modeling, and we could save about 30% on vessels, which came to some tens of millions of dollars. But of course, very senior leader who was responsible for the drilling rigs felt this was a big risk because, of course, a rig can at that time cost you $300,000 a day, whereas a vessel could cost maybe $30,000 a day. So his view was that you could save a couple of vessels, but one day of loss on the rig wipes off those savings. But in the conversation that I had with him, and this is the maturity of an organization like Shell, because it allowed such a junior staff like myself to be in a conversation with very senior leaders. And I did say to him, we could save both. There's no reason why we should, lose on the rigs. And there's no reason why we should also lose on the vessels. Why not an armed solution?
mm.
And the beauty of that was the leaders were willing to give it a chance. Although he was worried there was a big risk, but the leaders were ready to give it a go, and we did, and we saved tons of money from that. But that also gave a platform to even do more. We were then able to expand that beyond even Shell. We did an expansion to other oil companies within the UK, and we actually did expand it across the whole North Sea into UK, Holland, Norway, saving quite substantial amount of money. But I think leaders that I've seen, many of those leaders are willing to give talents and opportunities, irrespective of where they came from, irrespective of how low level those opportunities come from. I think once you can demonstrate the value of what you are bringing, once you can demonstrate the contribution to the organization's objectives, then leaders, I think, are usually very willing to look at those opportunities, identify the risk if there are any, but to drive for those value across the business.
It's nice that they were able to listen to a different perspective. And when you say mature, our leaders were mature, that they were able to listen to a low-level person like you pertaining to leadership, that's really interesting to me, because maturity seems to be something that is in the best of the best of leaders. What do you mean exactly by that? What do you mean by maturity in listening to someone that is lower level than you?
I think there are various characteristics of a good leader. I will say, a good leader must be, of course, able to articulate clearly the vision of where they want to take the business to. What are the key drivers that a leader wants to achieve in his organization? But a leader should not necessarily have all that it takes to deliver that vision. A leader will really need to look for talents in the organization and to be able to unleash the capability of those talents in the organization. I always say that a good leader should actually be very comfortable to have much, individuals who are even more intelligent than him in his team. Every team I've tried to lead, I always look for people who are even more intelligent than myself, because as a leader, you should not be the most intelligent in the room. You should be the one that you should have a good vision. You should have a good clarity on where you're going. You should have the strength to be able to help your team to overcome hurdles. But you should have in your team those who will be able to have different perspective, diversity, but even those who will have new creativity, new ideas. Because of course the world changes. There are new, ideas coming in, there are new opportunities everywhere, and you must be willing for this to emerge in your organization. And so I see mature leaders are those who are willing to listen, who understand that they don't have all the answers, who really understand where they want to go, but are open to get the resources and the talents in the organization to be able to come up with ideas, come up with how to get to that destination that they really need to achieve, and be able to listen. A good leader must be able to listen. It's I think one of the biggest traits for a good leader is that ability to listen, to be able to then utilize the ideas in a positive manner to inspire the organization, inspire his team to those sort of unleashing the talent in the organization.
And it seems like that's what the leadership did for you. They instilled that maybe even into you when you took, reins of the organization. And I actually want to talk about that. Here you are, starting from the storeroom, you're working your way up, you're being listened to, your thoughts, your ideas are being applied and making big changes in the organization, helping restructure and reorganize the organization. Then finally, I don't know how you get into that position. Are you promoted? Are you voted in? Are you elected? What that process was like. But I'd like you to share where you were at mentally when you got into that position of power. When I say power, I mean CEO. Did you feel any different? Did you act any different? Was it just a title change? How did you feel and act differently now that you were in this role?
I think, of course, I grew through the ranks and, had fulfilled various roles both in Nigeria but also in the UK. I had, of course, over this period also learned a lot from leaders. I had seen how I had worked very closely with many leaders and learned from them. And when I became CEO, I think there were some aspects of the role that I will say I was probably well prepared for, but I would say there were also some other parts that I wasn't well prepared for. I think when you think about aspects like really being clear on the deliverables, what we wanted to achieve. Going into that role, I was very clear what I wanted to achieve. I set out three main objectives. The organization I was CEO for was already a successful organization, and so I set out three objectives. One was to continue to build on that success so that we don't lose on the value that the company was already delivering. Second was to move the business to the next level, to really go for breakthrough performance, not just what the company was achieving at that time, but move it into the next level of performance. And thirdly was to be an inspiration for the country, for that company to inspire the rest of Nigeria how to run successful businesses, to be able to add a lot of social value to the country as well. And so those three objectives were very clear, measurable. I had very clear targets for that and all of that. It was also very clear to me that you needed to develop an A to B in terms of where the organization itself was at and how you wanted to move it to where it needs to be in terms of performance management. So really clear metrics of what we are going to deliver, well communicated, and really, really well articulated for the team. It was very clear to me that I needed to really inspire the organization and really develop the people, develop talent. So that was very clear to me because those were things I had experienced already in my career. And so I came up with a transformation journey very early on. Part of it was about culture change. Culture is always very important in any organization. I think it was Peter Drucker who said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if you don't have the right culture in an organization, no matter what strategies you come up with, you're not likely to make the impact you wanted to make. So a big cultural change program, mostly bottoms up in terms of the staff actually came up with those culture changes we needed to achieve. Everybody, through engagement, were able to articulate that very clearly. And there were very clear need for need to reduce costs in the organization because when I got in there, although within the first year we were already making record revenues, we made $11.5 billion in the first year that I was CEO. But as I looked into the next 5 years, I could see that things were going to be more challenging. I could see that the oil price, we had seen oil price cycle in many cycles over the past 30, 40 years. So I knew the next cycle of the high oil price was going to be a low oil price. I could see that the climate change challenge was going to lead to, more demand for renewables. I could see more projects coming in the LNG area that was also going to drive competition for us, especially in Asia. So I knew that our profitability wouldn't be as our revenues wouldn't be as high. We needed to tackle costs. So cost reduction was a big part of that. I saw the need to change our commercial model. So there were quite a lot of things that we worked on in those transformation. And of course, they were not so easy. And people were struggling, while in a period of having made about 11.6 billion, I had paid 5.6 billion to shareholders, generous bonus to staff. People were wondering, why on earth will you be talking about a transformation? You're doing very well. And I had to really spend time communicating, working with others to really make sure everybody could understand, where we were heading to. It took quite a long time for people to get there, and some never got there until about 4 or 5 years after, when everything I said was going to happen didn't happen, was when some really got to pick it. But to your question, there were a few things that I think I wasn't so as well prepared for. I think one of it I will say was about the what I will call the social dynamics. I think the external space was one area I wasn't as well prepared for. I think when you grow up in an organization, especially one that is quite structured, at lower levels, you are not quickly exposed to external stakeholder in the big extent that you have to manage when you become a CEO. And so I was thrust into this big external space as CEO that I would say I had not had the grooming at a much lower level for what I needed to deal with. I needed to deal with government at the highest level. I was having to deal with the president, ministers. These were not things that I had prepared for at lower levels in the organization. And I will say that was one thing that I had to learn on my feet, and I had to walk through as I went along. I think the other thing I will say was, some of the shocks and the things that I wasn't expecting. Well, some of them were also external. I had to deal with a government agency that blocked the shipment of the company that I was leading. For close to 2 weeks, that I just didn't expect we could see such a difficult experience with an agency who wanted to collect what we considered an illegal tax from us, and we rejected this, and they then blocked us for a few weeks. So again, I would say, there were those sort of difficult issues in the external space that I would say, you don't grow up in an organization being prepared for dealing with all those sort of difficult things. So I would say some aspects I think were bread and butter. I had grown through the ranks to understand that, to understand, what's the bottom line, what are the value drivers, the role of staff, of course, the role of your external stakeholders, I was clear about. But real bigger issues in the external space, I think, were areas that I had to grow into.
Interesting. So you were able to, communicate the future into the present within your own organization. You changed the perspective by providing a vision, which changed the behaviors, like the culture you talked about, which resulted in these actions, these lower costs, this more profitability. Yet when it comes to the external social dynamics, a little bit more difficult. That's an interesting use your case right there.
You know what I say, Kevin? I always look at leadership, maybe from four perspectives. I say, there's the intelligence part of leadership. People call it IQ sometimes. I think, when you're at a lower level, your IQ is probably your biggest tool. I think as you grow up and you start managing people and you start managing team, I think your emotional intelligence starts to play, your EQ starts to play, and as you manage teams and you become more senior, that plays more than your IQ, if I will compare that way. But I think as you then move into more senior role, as you start getting close to company C-suites, I think you start to see the social intelligence, the social quotient, if I use that word as well, and that also starts to grow, even probably as big as your emotional intelligence as well. Your intelligence IQ is still there, but it's not as big as these two issues, your EQ and your SQ. And I think you also then have adversarial quotient, as I say, because you face adversary. Sometimes you face challenges. You face some hurdles that you have to overcome as well. And so you also have that AQ that I think you need to deal with. So I always draw a bubble in my head that it's like an onion. Your IQ is at the center of your leadership toolkit. At some point you grow, and then you have an EQ that surrounds it. Your IQ is still there, but your EQ is surrounding it. As you grow more senior into the C-suite, your SQ starts to also be part of it. And then, of course, you have your AQ as well. And one thing I then say also differentiates in my mind, Kevin, between if you're a leader in a developed country, or if you are leading in a developing or in a frontier type country. I think in a developed country like in the West, your IQ and your EQ are probably the biggest part of what you really need, because socially things are a lot more, I will say, stable, and you don't have as much adversary. I would not necessarily like you don't have, but you don't have as much as you have in developing countries. So you still need all the four, but I think if you're in a developing country, actually your SQ and your AQ become very important when you start to get into the sort of CEO role, because you really need to start to deal with a lot more social issues, a lot more adversarial issues than you normally face in Western world, and how you manage that then becomes even more important.
Interesting. So Babs, help me out here. So if emotional intelligence can be increased by, let's say, self-awareness, right? If you're very self-aware of yourself and aware of others, you have a pretty strong emotional intelligence. Now, when it comes to a social intelligence, what are some qualities for you that stand out? What makes a good, strong, social, intelligent leader?
I think it's about stakeholders, how you enroll stakeholders. So these are external to your organization now. And how do you talk about, normally we talk about shareholder value maximization as what's key for organization. But I think, you actually start to talk about stakeholder value maximization. So you look beyond your organization. You start to look at society. You start to look at how do you enroll others in society to make a difference. Maybe I give an example. If you're in a developing country, one of the things you find is that things like your supply chain may be a lot uh, longer because you're importing a lot of products from outside your country. um, but what that creates, of course, is that it creates this limited local capacity in your country, and it creates unemployment as well. So you get huge unemployment in your immediate surrounding, and that unemployment, you can look at it and think, well, it's not none of my problem. It's unemployment. It's outside my organization, but of course, it has all these social issues have impact on you as an organization, has impact on even how profitable you can be, because those social issues can come to impact on you in a negative manner. And so how do you work with other stakeholders in the country to bring local capacity, local competence, or local capacity into the country? How do you bring manufacturing into the country? How do you bring industrialization into the country? How do you help with community development to create jobs for communities, such that you don't have an army of unemployed around you? So the ability, I think, to engage with stakeholders and to be able to create value even outside the organization with a clarity that by doing that, you're actually able to then maximize your own profitability, I think is one of the key elements of how you build that social skills that I was describing.
Bob's, it is a pleasure to have you on this show, and for this reason, we tend to focus mostly on social impact focused organizations that describe exactly what you just described there, the stakeholder approach. We're going to focus on our customers. We're going to add value or environmental or social value to the value chain. How do we increase, let's say in Patagonia's example, an organic cotton supply chain so that the dyes don't ruin the waste streams and the environment and the society and the culture and the communities that they serve? It's the communities that we have to focus on to maximize, stakeholder value. Now, here's the lens that I'm approaching this from, Bab, so you can understand where I'm coming from. The arch nemesis always tends to be the big oil companies. And I'm just throwing this out as the lens that I am coming from so you can understand. When we think of publicly traded organizations, specifically, gas and oil companies, if you are to say, I'm going to maximize stakeholder value, it makes sense to me. But also, if a new technology comes that's going to reduce your costs, that's going to put tons of people out of jobs, that might not be the most ethically sound model that you have, but it's also going to increase your profitability. It's interesting to me, and I say it's a pleasure to have you on, because now what you're saying is you're in this position and you've got to deal with external people talking about a conversation. How do you make a sound decision, Babs? That a right decision that may go against the profitability, let's say, as a leader of an organization?
I think the key that I find is the ability to articulate, value, and it's been able to articulate it also on a long-term basis. I think sometimes we're very carried away with short-term value. And I think that's why you increasingly find organizations now are tying CEOs' remuneration to long-term performance, not just this year's performance, but how the company is done over a period of time. And I think as you start to look at that sort of longer time horizon, you start to see indeed why it's very important that decisions you take are not just profitable for a year, but decisions that will enable you to continue to grow profit over the years. It's very easy to destroy, value in a short time and make profit in that year, but you will see the consequences in later years. And I think that goes into the sort of example you were given. How do you make a decision that looks difficult on the organization now, but is beneficial for the stakeholders? And I think that will only, it may not show on your bottom line in that year, but it will show over a period of time. So let me give an example.
Sure.
I remember once as well. I was running a function. I was vice president for a function in logistics infrastructure and HSE in Nigeria. And one of the areas I was looking at was on helicopters. And we had this helicopter contract that was, already with a company for many years. They'd really become like a monopoly. And, there was an opportunity to change that paradigm. I worked together with my team. We were able to find two other companies. They were able to develop capacity, and after competition, we got them to we got one of them won the tender basically. But I then saw that there was opportunity to really develop this, it was a local company, or to develop this company because they were going to be hiring or leasing helicopters for 7 years. And I thought, that's not right. You should be able to buy helicopters. But they couldn't afford it. They just didn't have the money to afford it at that time. So I was able to get the organization, Shell, to loan them $85 million to buy these new helicopters. Now, if you look at our books in that year, you will see we've been impacted by these $85 million that had to leave the company. But over the 7 year period, this company, delivered to us helicopter services at less than more than 20% lower cost than we had previously. And by the time you factor in, the value we got from this company over that period, it was way in excess of that $85 million that we had loan them.
Okay.
So if you take a 1 year view, you might get a wrong impression of where value is. As you take a longer term view, you will then see, the decision that may look like it's not giving immediate value to the company in day one will give that value in the long term. So I would say, having a longer term view is a way to ensure that decisions indeed that may be stakeholder driven do contribute to maximizing the shareholder value.
Interesting. A longer term perspective helps change the behaviors of you and the others you're dealing with. Interesting. And that's a really good example too that I like. Now, Babs, you've mentioned merging versus developing countries and how those decisions may be different, how the growth of an organization may be different, how the mentality may be different. What about, Nigeria do you think is different than a shell organization in a modern developed organization in terms of how you act and decide as a leader?
So I think it's a great question, Kevin. And I think if you look at Shell in Nigeria and Shell, in UK or in Holland, I think the beauty of multinationals, of course, is that they already have what I would call global standards. So you nearly have what's like a barest minimum of how they operate, the standards to which they operate, the best practices that they can apply. And I think Shell, like most multinationals, are able to deploy these best practices across the globe, and that guides even local companies how they operate. So I will say, from a lot of practices in Shell in Nigeria or in the UK, they will look alike. So, human resource practices, how you hire people, how you manage performance, how you carry out activities like contracts and procurement. So you have quite a lot of those standards that I will say are very, very common. Having said that, I always say that you must always keep in mind the context, because context, of course, makes a difference. And when I look at say those two countries that I use as an example, Nigeria and the UK, maybe there are three things I would say you should always think about that will be different. I think we kind of touched on one of them already, one of them being stakeholder versus shareholder value, stakeholder value, shareholder value. Let me give you an example. If you are in Shell in the UK, if you talk about community development, it doesn't make much meaning because, of course, the governments of the UK or in Western world are already taking care of the communities. They build roads, they have electricity, they have water, basic infrastructures are there, health facilities are there. So if you're a CEO in Shell UK, your community development will probably be to equip some schools with computers and laptops and all those sort of tokenism, if I will use that word. They're not really developing communities because they're developed. But if you are a CEO of Shell in Nigeria, where it's developing, your immediate communities don't have electricity, they don't have water, they don't have roads. Your community development focus needs to be different. It needs to be thinking around how do you work with the government, how do you work with stakeholders to make sure that these communities have these facilities, and that I think makes a difference. And so I would say that's one area that you really need to think differently if you are in Shell in Nigeria or you're Shell in the UK. And the other area I would say you need to think differently, of course, if you're in both areas, I would think is in the courage that you will have, courage to overcome the hurdles you will meet. I think if you're in any Western world as a CEO, although you have some hurdles, by and large, they are hurdles that I think, yeah, if you're in the oil and gas industries, there may be mighty hurdles like climate change, of course, that you have to deal with as a societal issue, which is quite substantial. Or, of course, if you're in Holland, then you're dealing with earthquakes or big issues like that as well. But I think, in developing countries like Nigeria, you even have a lot more hurdles than those. You might be having to deal with government regulators. You might be having to deal with lack of institutions in those countries that you have to, law and order is quite different. Security is a different challenge. So you really have, I will say, a different level of courage that you need to have to be able to lead and overcome quite a lot of these hurdles. And I think the last thing I would think is also different. I will say it's on integrity as well. And integrity, I will say, if you think about these big organizations as well, they of course have standards of how they manage integrity issues in the corporation. But I think you drive that in the Western world on a compliance basis. People just comply. I mean, it's society is already that well structured that people naturally, ethically are able to comply to things, and people don't you don't see in society the level of corruption you might find in developing countries. I think if you go into developing countries and you try to manage just compliance, you will be dealing with what I call the iceberg effect. People will comply, and in the top of the iceberg you think you're really managing ethical issues, but beneath the iceberg will be a lot of things that I think are going on. I think you need to manage not just compliance, but you need to start to work on commitments. How do you get commitments? Because for people in those organizations, what they see in society uh, is different from what the expectations of the global organizations are. Unlike in the Western world, where what they see in society, it's exactly what they see in the company. So there's alignment between what they see outside and what they see inside. In developing countries, it's not the case. What they see outside is different from what they see inside. So the compliance culture just doesn't work on integrity and ethics. You really need commitment. How do you grow that? How do you ensure that? I think is one of the things that you really need to work on as a leader. So I would think at the very least, those three things I would say, are quite different between developing countries and developed countries. And as a leader in those organizations, you really need to be, on top of those sort of issues to really make a difference.
There's a lot to unpack there, but I think the one thing that sticks out to me, Babs, is building trust within your communities. And I really think that's what it boils down to, whether it's trust in the UK or trust in Nigeria. you're going to run into different things. But let's stay on that commitment to compliance and trust within, no corruption in the communities that your organization in Nigeria serves. What is one good way, or a few good ways, or a mentality to have to build trust within those organizations? Communities, excuse me.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kevin. And we used to have a saying. We when I was still in Shell, we used to say, trust comes to you on a bicycle. Trust leaves you on a Ferrari. Uh, it's so difficult to build trust, but it's so easy to lose trust. And trust is earned. Really, you have to earn it. You cannot demand it. You cannot say to people, you trust me, trust me. No, nobody trusts. I think there's even a natural distrust of people in leadership. I think once you're in leadership, people just don't trust you. I think you can nearly start from that basis because they think you know something, they think you're doing something, and people really don't trust you. So you really need to earn it. And I think there are many things you need to do as a leader to earn it. I think one of it is that your words and your action must be consistent. You have to be authentic. If your words and your actions don't match, people will figure it out very quickly. I think the organization is able to read a leader very quickly. If you say one thing and you do another thing, if you say one thing in public and do something in private, then people then don't just trust you. So you must be consistent. You must be authentic, and I think you really need to follow through on your commitments. If you say something, you have to follow through. Because I think people want to have that confidence that when you say something, you're going to do exactly that. I think people will trust you when they also see that you're really on a journey, you're on a mission that is indeed going to make a difference and positively impact them. If people think you're on a selfish mission, you're on a mission for yourself, just to further your own nest, then I think people don't really want to trust you. But I think if they see that you're on a mission and your vision is one that will really bring value for a larger pool, then I think people will start to look at trusting you. So I think there are several aspects and elements of trust, Kevin, and I think you have to work on it as a leader. You cannot, every mistake you make sets you back, I think, 10 steps backward. And you're always on the platform. I would say you're being watched 24/7. Every action of yours is being measured and judged. And so you really just need to be authentic, say what you want to do exactly what you say, really make sure your vision is one that really gets best value for everyone, that you're not selfishly trying to promote yourself into just self actualization alone. I think those are the kind of things I would say.
That's interesting. And that's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is what you had just said, words and action and where they align, they must align. But what's scary for me as someone who is maybe more toward the bottom is this is, are they really those perfect individuals that they say they are? Are they really flawless as leaders, as human beings? I mean, when it comes to admitting mistakes, admitting wrongs, did you ever run into a challenge? And how do you perceive vulnerability as a leader?
Great question, Kevin. I think the first thing, indeed, as a leader, you must make clear is that you're a human being as well. Sometimes I think there's an expectation. Leaders try to show a persona that sometimes could feel larger than life. But I think people connect to you more when they feel you're human. You make mistakes as well. You admit your mistakes, and you learn. You move forward and you correct those mistakes. And I think it's very, very important that people see you as that you are a human being and you make mistakes. I remember while I was going through this transition that I mentioned to you earlier on in my first role as CEO, one of the changes I wanted to run was an organization change. And we have redesigned the organization change. It was supposed to be the smallest part of the change, because the organization change to me was really to enhance our culture change. It wasn't really a big cost saving or anything. That wasn't what it was. but it became very controversial. And by the time I went to the board actually didn't approve that organization change. It was a bit of a setback for me and setback for the whole organization. And, it was indeed very, very difficult for my team that was working with that. I had to come back to the organization from the board to say, look, one, the board has not approved this change. Two, business as usual will not continue, so we will have to still do something different. Three, I'm going to work with my team, my management team, to decide how we will go about review this and see what we do differently, and then come back to the team. So of course I went back with my leadership team. We reviewed it. We thought maybe we had approached the change as one massive change. Maybe we should have taken it as phased changes. Maybe it was just too big. And I also found that there were some other factors that I hadn't considered. So, went back and discussed this with the board, and they agreed, and we then make those changes in phases, which worked well. But one of the things that also came out from that, Kevin, was when I went back to my team the morning after this change wasn't approved. The team that was working on this change with me, as I entered the boardroom with them, and so as I entered the meeting room to discuss with them, they were really, all their heads were down. They felt really, really sad. It was really a bad time for them. They felt all this work, all this effort has gone to nothing. And one of them asked me a great question. He said, Babs, are you going to dissolve this team now? We've kind of failed. Are you going to dissolve us? So I told them a story. I said, look, there was once a young executive in a company in the US. He was a marketing executive. He had convinced the CEO and the management team of a major change, of a new product launch that was going to really make so much money. It had cost them $10 million to do this product launch and all of that. But once they went out, after going through the launch, the product failed. It was a massive failure. And so the next morning, this young marketing executive, came to the CEO and came with his resignation letter. He said, boss, I'm very sorry I've let you down. I know you had so much confidence in me. You had so much trust in me. This whole product has failed. Here's my resignation letter. And the CEO looked at him, collected his resignation letter and tore it and said, I've just spent $10 million to train you. Why will I allow another company to, take $10 million trained chap, get back into work and, go use that $10 million we've used in training you to make a difference? And that's what I said to the team. And they left that room feeling really pumped up, and they went on to do great things. And I still see many of them today, and they still tell me that story made a big difference. So, I think failure is one of the key things a leader really always needs to admit. If you fail, you admit it. You have to show you are human. You are blood and flesh like everyone. You have to be able to walk through your failures and make sure that you learn from it. You use the learnings to decide what's the best course of action, and that I think is very important for trust. If your staff feel you don't acknowledge your mistakes, I think they will never trust you.
And that's been a consistent theme throughout your career, framing opportunities, framing challenges, framing failure. It's been quite consistent, and pays tribute to kind of you as a leader yourself. Now, I want to kind of conclude with this, and I think it's also been a constant theme throughout you, and I hope you would agree with this. And it'd be this: the leadership, saw you and had this bottom-up approach. That was the legacy thinking they had. That was instilled in you. Now you are here in a position, and you are leaving your own legacy. When you're gone, what would you say a mark of a good leader is?
I would say, Kevin, that a good leader should have at least three things. I would say. I think a good leader must have a vision of where they need to get to. A leader must be someone who can see behind the mountain. He can see through a tunnel. Because I think people want to know where they are going to, and they want to know that where they're going to is going to be better than where they are. And I think a leader must be able to see that and articulate that, communicate that, and carry people along. The second thing I think a good leader must have is the ability to inspire the team, the people, the staff, to inspire them, to motivate them, to want to get on that journey, to motivate them to develop them and to coach them and make sure that they have the tools and techniques to get to that next level that they want to get to. And then the third thing I think a leader needs to always do is have the ability to support and help the people, the staff, to go on that journey, because they will of course go through challenges as they go on that journey, and they must be able to help them overcome challenges and all of that. So I would say three things a leader should always have: one, clear vision of where they're heading to, and how that vision is going to be better for everyone that's a key stakeholder, and clarity about how they communicate that, developing their team, inspiring their team, making sure the team really wants to get to that destination, and really want to do it because they believe it. If it's great vision, really at some point the leader, it needs to stop being the leader's vision. It needs to be the whole organization's vision, and then the leader has to help them. So it's about leading from the front, leading with the team, and leading behind the team. Really is what a leader's role is: knowing when to step up, step back, and step by the side, to help your team get to a much better place than where you started from.
Bobs, I love the answer. It's been, such a pleasure speaking with you, learning about your mentality, your mindset, where you came from on today's episode. Let's bring this home now. What is your definition of a real leader?
A real leader is a leader who can take a group of people to a much better place, and with the group of people really feeling that they want to go to that better place, really putting in their best, and the leader really making people to actually do more than their potential in reaching that better place.
I love it. For Bob's Omotowa, I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there, take people to a better place. And always, folks, keep it real. Thanks, Bobs.
Thank you very much.